Today on the podcast, I have the honor of speaking with Alan Douches. Alan is a 3-time Grammy-winning mastering engineer and the owner of West Side Music. He's mastered over 16,000 albums and has worked with bands such as Converge, Dillinger Escape Plan, Mastodon, Every Time I Die, the Black Dahlia Murder, Wage War, and more. I've been working with Alan for almost 8 years now, and he's the one that puts the finishing touches on everything I mix. On this episode, we discuss what mastering really is and why it's more than just making things louder, why teamwork and communication are the secret ingredients to a great sounding record, common misconceptions artists have about mastering and how to avoid them, how streaming platforms are changing the game when it comes to loudness, a glimpse into the future of immersive audio with Dolby Atmos, and why being original in your sound is more important than ever. Whether you're a band, producer, or just a music nerd, this one's packed with insight. So let's dive in. So Alan, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. You're my first interview that I'm doing, and I really couldn't think of a better person to have on. So I really appreciate you coming on today.
Dan, it's been a couple of years we've been working together, and it's something that I really enjoy doing. I guess some people would call it maybe quasi-mentoring or educating, right, et cetera. Worked with, lots of people through my career, and, it's still a lot of fun, getting in the trenches and, seeing what new bands are doing, what new engineers are doing, what new producers, new mixers are doing. And so that kind of excites me. So it's been great, and certainly we've been doing some great product lately. So we got to just keep it going. Yeah. No, it's been great. I feel like not only has the work that I produce sounded so much better since working with you, but I've learned so much in the process, and I've always enjoyed our talks and everything like that. And it's definitely been, like you said, a bit of a mentoring experience. So I really appreciate that. And I figured now would be a good time to kind of share your knowledge with my audience and kind of just show them just really what is, mastering all about. And so at this point, everyone would have already heard a little bit of your bio, and they kind of know your backstory if they don't know you already. So we could kind of dive right in. So I wanted to kind of just jump right in and say, what is mastering? Yeah, that's the question, right? It's this unknown thing that happens at the end of the chain, right? Mm-hmm. No, I think we've gotten a lot better at kind of giving that first description as to what it is. A lot of people put a lot of stuff on their master bus and call it mastering, and it is. I mean, it's basically somebody consciously, making the effort to say this is it, right? It's the final chance to do any adjustments, to have any opinions, and to assemble it as whatever it is. If it's a single, if it's a album, an EP, what formats are they going out on? So it's nice to get that fresh perspective in at the end. For some people, that I work with, that may mean, getting stems and adjusting and helping them find the right balance that, hits through the right way. To some other people that I work with, it's just doing that final 10% tweak to just kind of sweeten it, matching levels between tracks. Because, there are people that mix like the entire album in one session because there is a consistency to that. But even then, there's from song to song to song, you want to just make sure it flows well and you have that contiguous feel throughout an album. So it's hard to do that when you're mixing sometimes. So that's a great time to do it in mastering. Adjusting fades, sequencing, song spacing, exporting for all the proper formats. Yeah.
And, I often tell bands, too, it's just another level of quality control. I always find like the more collaborative you could be, the better the end product.
It's teamwork, right? I mean, that, no matter how many people you have in your team, on your team, it's about working together. I hear lots of stories of mixers, of mastering engineers, of producers, that don't communicate very well. And it's no wonder that the relationships go south, that they sour out, That's what it's all about, is working together as a team. If you're serious, there are lots of people that are just doing something as a hobby, and that's awesome. I've done plenty of those records, where it's a vanity project and people just want to have the thrill of having their record done, and that's great. But when you're starting to put it all on the line and you're going to be going out and touring or trying to get on a tour and you're going to be working a record for, 8 months, 9 months, a year, and you're putting all this effort into it, you want to make sure that before you get out there, you put all of the effort up front on making your album, your product, as great as possible, because this is where it's supposed to be fun. That's what I say to people. Now once we're done, now the hard work begins, right? Touring, gigging, playing, trying to get fans, building that fan base, building those followers, that's the hard work. You better be having fun while you're making your record.
Yeah. That is supposed to be the fun part, and then it's like you said, it's kind of just after it's out there, how grinding and getting it heard. And that
and after all, that is the final stop, right? You could have a great song or a great hook or amazing guitar player or whatever, but the reality is these days a lot of it comes down to that live performance and how do you get those people to those gigs? They're going to hear you somehow, so you've got to try to put your best foot forward on this. Yeah,
and it's obviously. Great songwriting is number one. It doesn't matter how good you make something sound if it's not a good song. But, you want to showcase that song in the best way possible. If you're taking your music serious, you're putting all this time into writing these great songs, you want it to sound as good as possible. And that also shows the people listening to it that you care about it. You're putting that attention to detail in,
Yeah, but the irony is that there are a lot of bands that don't put enough time in on that front part, right? And then they get pickier and pickier as it goes along. I don't know if it's just that the time bomb is ticking away or something, but suddenly it gets to mastering and they're like, oh no, I got to redo that vocal. It's like, huh? It's like, should have been thinking about that a while ago, folks. I mean, it's fine. I think yourself, myself, a bunch of people that we work with, it's all about, it's just got to be awesome, no matter what it takes, right? And, so you don't turn people down for that, but you want to kind of like knock on the door and say, hey, listen, are all your vocals good? Are are all your parts right?
I've had more times than I'd like to, even say, really, is where I'll send off a mix and the mix revisions aren't actual mix revisions. It's like, oh, after hearing it mixed, we decided to redo this part, or have had arrangement changes. I'm like, that's not really mix revisions. Now you're, this was supposed to be worked out. This is what pre-production is for, and
yeah, unfortunately, I mean, again, we live in that zone, right? I mean, I was talking to somebody about this, that that the artists that we work with very often, they are also our customers, right? It's like, and even like a lot of the label stuff that I do, although maybe the label is behind it and paying for it, it's really the artist that's paying for it. This isn't like coming out of some huge budget at Sony Records. This is like hard-earned money that the band's going to be making. So you don't want to turn them down on any of that stuff. It's hard, and that's why we sit in these seats and other people don't.
And, it's the direction that music has gone. A lot of bands now, especially in metal, are taking on more of the recording side, where they used to always go to the studio where they had a team working with them to make sure the pre-production was done the right way, and that, listening back that the takes were the right takes. A lot of them are just figuring it out on the fly, and they think that mixing or mastering is this magical thing that's going to fix any imperfection that they had, in the recording phase. But there's only so much you could do. It's really, it's got to be good at the source.
Well, but then again, that gets back to communication. I mean, it's like, we encourage, I know you encourage, listen, if you're gonna work with us, get in touch early. I tell bands, especially after I've worked with them on one or two, I'm like, keep me in touch, keep me in the loop. Let me know what's going on. If they're starting to track something that you're going to be mixing, just when you're having your morning coffee, listen to an MP3 of whatever they're sending over. I tracked the guitars, check these out, and then you could kind of make some comments along the way. I always say it takes me 5 minutes to listen to a song to save me an hour later, right? I mean, and so, and I'm guessing maybe it's teamwork day or something. That's going to be the big phrase today, but it is. I should say, I probably could also say all of the successful records that I've been involved in are about teamwork, and sometimes the audience doesn't know it, right? Or the fans don't know it. It doesn't matter. It's just, it's just got to be great. There's got to be no excuses, Yep.
Yeah, and kind of what motivated me to get into the production side of things was, one, I have a love of metal music, but what I've always enjoyed is that collaborative process of, instead of me being in one band, I feel like I'm in every band I work with for that short period of time.
Right.
My name goes on it too. So I like kind of that, like you said, that teamwork, that team approach. I feel like we're all in this together. So it's not just me looking to be like, let's just mix it, get it out there. It's really, I think of it's all of our music in a way, because we've all put our stamp or our sound on it or had something to do with what that final product winds up ultimately being.
Well, that's, I think the people that, survive through the chaos in this professional side of the industry, realize that. And, and we take it on. Yeah. It's like you can get very, involved with a group or something and not see your family for nearly a week or two sometimes, and just like, I'm involved in this. I don't know, I'm going to be sleeping on the couch tonight. I'll see you tomorrow, or whatever. And, hopefully you have a significant other that understands that, and that you, on the other side, put in the really quality time. But that's the effort that it takes. Everybody kind of just looks at some of the success stories and thinks like, oh yeah, it must have been great or whatever. But, oh my God, the time I used to go to the Dillinger mix sessions in Manhattan, and just not to necessarily give my opinion, but to just hear where they were at. What's going on? How's it going? Where are we going with this? Because, we're on a deadline here, folks, and we've got to make sure it hits right. So if you're having questions about where it needs to go, let's get into it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of diving more into mastering specific type stuff. You work in all genres. Does that change your approach, your philosophy on it, or is it more just what you talk to with the artist? How do you approach? Because with such a wide span of genres, where's the headspace when you go into mastering? I've always thought that it's one of the things I enjoy and that keeps me fresh about it, right? If I had to do one genre all the time, I don't know, maybe, you'd start just phoning it in or something. I don't know. Maybe you'd find that, oh, yeah, well, here, let's hook up that compressor or let's hook up this, but sometimes it's kind of fun to maybe be working on an alt indie record. And then, you're going to work on a metal record. And so, you have the settings up from the alt indie thing, and you would never, use an optical compressor on a metal record, but it's there from that last project. And suddenly you just hit play and it's pumping through it. And you're like, well, that's kind of cool. Yeah.
Let's fine tune that. Let's see where we get with that. Yeah, I don't know. But to me, it's just about, it's not so much about a genre as much as it's about great music and the artist's, direction. What is it that they want? And, a common theme I talk about often is just, you got to be original. You've got to, you can copy anybody and be somewhat successful for a moment, but certainly the bands that succeed over the course of time have created a sound. They recreate themselves, and they stay in their lane, certainly, but it's fun to, get out of the lane a little bit and try some new stuff. And that's the fear of not having that team, right? Because if you're just a band at home and you're doing your stuff alone and you're not sharing it along the way with your production team, you could just be satisfied with what sounds good compared to. But you're not thinking, like I said, in many cases, we can finish a record and it really isn't going to hit, the masses for 6 months between the pre-promotion that's got to happen with a single or two or whatever they're going to drop, and then getting it out. And by the time the push out, it could be 6 months down the road. So don't copy what's going on now. Try to say, where do I want my sound to be? What do I want it to be?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's often the challenge is finding that sound. That some bands are always reinventing their sound, but trying to find that niche, that could be a bit of a challenge for a band.
Yeah, and it's, again, as a team, I know we've done this, and I do it with other people too, where you'll say, Alan, have you heard this new record? So and so, check it out. And we check it out, and we're like, wow, yeah, that's cool. That's awesome the way that worked on that or whatever it was, and just staying current. That's another thing you want from your team, I'd suppose, is that, like, certainly, we've got our hands deep into the technology and kind of seeing what's happening. You want your team to be able to say, no, been there, done that. It's not going to work, or what, that's getting overplayed. I know you guys think it's cool, but trust me, there's a newer way to do this, and let's do this instead.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going off of that, is there anything that you're finding more specifically with metal bands that you wish they understood more about mastering, before they even get you involved?
Very often, it's about future proofing in general, right? But I think that's especially true with the volume wars, right? In that that are ever present in heavy music, is that that although making your record loud and punchy and very present in a playback algorithm, whatever it is, Spotify, Apple, Tidal, wherever, that's incredibly important. You've got to realize that there's a way to get there that sounds right. That's and I say future proofing, in that it's like, you want to make sure that you're not just making it loud for the sake of loud. That you want it to be full and rich and deep sounding before it gets to mastering. Because if I can add it, sure, and we often will do whatever it takes to get that approach. But certainly those records, those iconic records that still, stand up over time, that future proofing, they were coming in the door pretty well set. Yeah. They weren't rescue acts in a sense. Mm-hmm. So I mean, from a metal standpoint, it's just you gotta, I'm probably going to overstate it. Like I said, it's teamwork. It's trust your team, work with your team. And that doesn't mean blindly just agree, but that just means, listen, you're choosing these people to work with for a reason. Trust them, work with them, hear their opinions out. I've had many times, a band is here, without their production team, and then you hear them talking like, oh man, I didn't ever want to do that, or why did he make a, it's just like, dudes, did you say something? Wow, he's so and so. Who are we to say? I don't know. Everybody that somebody wants to hear it, as far as I know. They don't want to shut it down.
It's your music, So yeah. Yes, they're helping you create that music, but at the end of the day, it's your music. So it should sound the way that you want it to, and work with a team that, if you have a clear vision, can help you achieve that vision. That's really what's like picking the team, is knowing that they're capable of delivering what you envision the music sounding like. And even when it comes to, like you said, loudness, it's not thinking of loudness of just the sake of being loud. If you're using it as an aesthetic, if it's something that is almost like a part of the texture of the music itself, right, that's really cool. If it's loud for just the sake of being loud, it's just going to fatigue the ear.
Right, and what happens, is through your production process, recording, overdubbing, mixing, you're starting to get bored with it. So you just start piling on that two-bus processing, more exciter, more compression, more, inflator, or whatever it is. And so it's, you're feeding into what you're missing, which is the groove to begin with. I think, like in a lot of records, I hear the records that people love, and you go, it's the arrangements are simple. They're there. They're and the mix, just put them all up on the plate the right way. They're not. And then if we need to make it loud, we'll make it loud. But I got to say, too, I think in general, I forget what the number is. It's, I want to say, I think it's 83%. 83% of the listening audience as of, this day in 2025, 83% listen with some kind of volume normalization on. And that's whether they know it or not, right? Yeah. So in a sense, and I've had this with in many cases where artists are just like, no, man, it's got to be louder. And I'm saying, like, you're not hearing it right. And then sure enough, they go, oh, wow, why is it being pulled down? Well, because 83%. So it's not about overall volume. It's about density. It's about thickness. It's about, making sure it's all full, and then when it's dynamic and loud, then it still comes across that way. That's a big thing in heavy music is just, leave room for it to be loud on the streaming processing,
Yeah. Yeah, which and that's the other that's the other thing that makes it great to work with a dedicated mastering engineer is, you're knowing how to optimize.
We're listening all the time. It's just like, we ask artists to let us know when the stuff goes up. And it's one of the first things I do is I'll pop it up. But in all formats too. I mean, I'll put it up on Apple. I'll put it up on Spotify. If it's on Tidal, I'll put it up on Tidal. See how they're reacting, because they're also moving targets. And then Spotify has multiple tiers of listening. Right? They've got the free version, which is the crappier
right?
version. And then if you have a full-on paid version, like Rose in her office does, it's like she gets to hear a higher quality. Yeah, it's understand. I mean, all along the process. It's understanding the technology and how to best implement it in the team.
Yeah. Do you find? I mean, you work with so many different artists and at so many different levels. So this might be kind of a tough question to say if there's any one thing. But do you find that there's still any myths that like bands come into with you about mastering, like? Or is it like it's so all over the place you can't really think of one thing that stands out at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest myth is that you can change. You have a chance to make changes in mastering, right? Like you can bring the vocal up, you can bring the snare up, or all that. And yeah, I mean, got a great set of tools, surrounding me in my room, and yeah, we can do stuff like that, but it's all going to just be a sacrifice at something else. Even with, the newer, AI technology where, we can kind of pull things apart and put them back together. Yeah. Okay. So now, the drummer is happy. The snare is louder. Great. But everybody else in the band is not happy because they also ruined the guitar tone, and it's stepping all over the vocal now, So, I mean, I actually, okay. So funny story number one, right? So I did a record with a band, this is probably going back 10 years or so, and, whatever. And, I guess it was more than the 10%, right? Like whatever I did added, such value to what they did. They were just thrilled. Next time, 2 years later, whatever, I get an email. Hey, Alan, we're coming. We got another album. Oh, great. Let me, let me know when you got the mixes done, because let me, love to check on them. Oh, no, we're not going to bother mixing. We're just going to send it to you. I'm like, I swear to you on all my relatives' graves. And I'm like, what? They were like, oh, yeah, you made such a difference last time. We figured we're just going to let you do it. And I mean, that can quickly also lead to stems, right? That like a lot of people think that sending stems to mastering is better. Yeah, there's an option there to be better. But at some point, don't send me 48 stems, very common, maybe 2 or 3 stems, right? Could be helpful having a vocal stem, an instrumental stem, if you're uncomfortable with where the vocals should be. But always we want to get an approved stereo version as well, and only use those stems if we need to because a vocal is sibilant or something. Why should I DS the entire mix if it's really just the vocal that's sibilant, right? Or if, everybody, I mean, it happened recently with a very successful, mixing engineer. They ran out of time. He had to move on to another session, right? And so the mixer printed out stems for me. And he kind of just said, I did my best. Here it is. And each person in the band was just fine tuning and tweaking their individual. And I'm like, guys, you just paid this mixing guy. The individual tracks are fine. We just need little adjustments, but they wouldn't let go of it. Everybody wanted to keep tweaking.
Yeah. And that, again, comes to trusting the team, because that's where I sometimes make the argument to bands to not try and mix your own music is because you're so in the weeds of the songs that you lose that objectivity of like, what's the song supposed to sound like at that point? And I even think on my end with mixing, the benefit of having you putting the finishing touches is that's another layer of objectivity, because I start to get lost in the weed of my mix where the song stops being a song at some point and it winds up being 1,000 mix decisions. Like when I listen back, I'm hearing, oh yeah, this is when I automated the snare. And you get to hear it as, you know, the stereo mix where you could say, oh, no, you know, and it's so clear to you, something that we're all lost in. And that's where that collaborative, you know, just again, stressing it, putting it home, that having that team working on it together is really the key to getting the best sound.
Yeah, and especially if you're serious, right? And then if you're, and not to, and again, you know, vanity projects are awesome. You know, you should be allowed to make music. Nobody should say, no, you can't make music, right? But very often in the case of, of a production, you're going to do another record. You're going to move on, learn from this, grow from this, rather than making the experience, drag on and on and on so that everybody hated the experience. This is the fun part. I mean, I say that all you should be having fun, and the fun in whatever it is, whether it's, the release of angst or if it's just, putting out some poetry, whatever it is that is fun for you, you better be having it now, because again, the work is going to get hard if you want to take this seriously. And then that's the, and the other thing that I think we all talk so much about is how many songs are released every day and what that means to how do you get your music heard, right? So certainly you want to go out with the best possible product, and after all, it is a product. I mean, that's one of the things. There was a time where, when I was making really loud records, I was kind of getting pulled through the trash on the, on the boards or whatever, on the forums. And it's just like, obviously it's not my choice, but if an artist wants this to have that kind of impact, then I'm here to do the best job I can and make sure it's future-proofed and it sounds awesome all the way along the line. But there is a lot of product out there. And if you think that you can just put it together, at home on your own, great. Then your songs better be awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think there's value in at least learning how to do the basics, because I think then you gain a greater appreciation when you do have the team in. So like, it's always great to start.
Pushing each other, like I said, you'll send me, Alan, did you check out this record? If you're not pushing each other, within the team, either as the whole unit of a team or even just the mixer mastering, tracking mixer, whatever it is, you've got to constantly be pushing yourself, and obviously you know that's just to gain for a final product later on. We're not trashing something. We're like, oh wow, yeah, that is awesome. That does hit really hard. How did that happen? What was that?
Yeah, that's like what always excites me, listening back to when bands put something out, my favorite bands or even bands that I've never heard of before that just, I come across when I hear like a mix or a master or whatever, and I'm like, whoa, how did they get this? Or where it sounds kind of like you were saying, there could be that loud, but there's still so much dynamics to it. And then you just start scratching, wow, how did they do that? And that still excites me. And when you hear those bands put out something new and they do something different, it's like, whoa. It's always evolving, and I think that's what kind of makes it, fun. You never stop learning with it.
It is fun. It is a challenge. In a sense, we're engineers. We solve problems. There's all of this, behind it. Besides just being, an art form in a sense. But yeah, pushing the limits. Learning something new, trying something new. I once, way back when I was mixing records, I had worked with this producer, and the record was coming out really great. And at the end, he's like, "Hey, do you want to rent anything? You want to rent any gear for the mix?" And I'm like, "No, I think we got it. I think it sounded pretty awesome." He's just like, "Anything you're curious about, whatever." And I'm like, "I guess so." He's like, "Yeah, go get it. Go rent it. Let's check it out." And that kind of freshness about a production, and he obviously is a very successful producer, and just, knew that you got to keep that freshness about things. And as it turned out, that piece of equipment, yeah, of course we used it, and it was awesome, so.
Yeah, cool. And, at this point, you've been doing this for so long. What at this point is exciting you about mastering? What is it, or what are you excited about for the future?
Do we want to go down an Atmos road? I mean,
we could.
Well, I would suggest, and for your listeners here, obviously there's no paperwork. We don't have a script here. We could touch upon it. It might make for a longer conversation because there's a lot of angles to it, and maybe even get some of the bands involved, I mean, I think that what excites me is a multi-formatted future, and always has, and that's, the final stop of mastering is, making it sound great, on earbuds, cars, stereos, PA systems, wherever it translates. That's the artistry of mastering, is knowing how that's going to transcend. And now we have Atmos coming at us, and it's awesome when it's done. The problem is it's new, and I have a friend who was an engineer in the 70s and worked on a lot of big records, three of Queen's records, et cetera. And he was telling me, like, where we're at with Atmos now is kind of like where they were in stereo in the 60s. And he used to work with a lot of engineers that were in the 60s as he was coming up in the 70s. And they were like, oh, man, it took years to figure out stereo, right? And I think we're in that same boat right now, is that we're learning how to use it. It's not just a fad. We've had, stereo for 50 plus years or whatever, and wave file formats for, stereo waves for probably close to 40 years or something. You're telling me technology can't advance us any further than just a stereo wave file?
Yeah.
So like I said, I could go on and on about that, but it is the same thing of the translation, right? That's what still excites me. It's like, it's not just about making it sound great in one environment. It's making it sound great in the car, on the phone, and if it's even just the speakers on the phone, it's got to be balanced, and that's a dynamic and an EQ thing, and finding what part of the arrangement is making that exciting. Is it the vocal? Is it the drumming? Is it the percussiveness of the drums? What's driving the groove? And that's just what you learn from years of experience.
Yeah. What I think is really cool about the Dolby Atmos, too, is as it does gain popularity, it's another way to have music be an immersive experience again. I feel like it's become very passive. Over the last few years, people, you have so much access to everything that it's hard to get people's attention, where it used to be like vinyl. You put the vinyl on, you sit, you look at the album art, it becomes an experience. Dolby kind of recreates that in the modern age, the Dolby Atmos, because it's a fully immersive experience, but it's getting people to, you have to have a setup to truly appreciate the full setup. But I think some cars are starting to come with, I think,
21,
Dolby Atmos. 21
auto manufacturers are now offering it as an option. And I get a lot of calls from people or emails. Alan, have you been to the Sphere? Have you been out, to Las Vegas and heard that? It's like when people hear a really great audio experience, they're thrilled with. I mean, look at the advancements of live sound technology. It's like, it's amazing how, having arrays and spreading the sound properly. It's not about just blowing somebody away on the first 5 rows and the people, up in the rafters are hearing just the gigantic echo of Madison Square Garden. It's like they've come light years to make sound better for live performance. We're still stuck with stereo audio, stereo wave files, And I've said this a couple times now on some forums and things where it's just like, if you're fine with stereo and you think this is just a fad, my suggestion is you better start putting your fad as stereo in Atmos. Because it's here, labels are demanding it, it's going to trickle down. You don't have to have, 14 speakers, to appreciate it. It's an experience where it just helps define where sounds go. And the very, very same file, that's, the biggest misnomer is the very same file that will play back, a stereo version in your speakers, will play back a binaural setup in your headphones, will play back, a 5.1 in your, Sonos system or whatever. Or if you happen to have a bigger system, it'll play back an even more enjoyable experience. But it's the same file. We're not making people go buy new hardware, new software. It's kind of like experiencing vinyl, a vinyl record from the 70s and putting it on a great turntable, right? And you go, oh my God, this sounds unbelievable, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it was there. It was built into the format, and CDs kind of had that. I mean, we're going down a weird techie area here, but but it's about that future-proofing, right? It's like, and it took a while too, right? Again, with CDs, it's like the first CDs that came out were sterile sounding. They just didn't have the warmth or whatever. We figured out how to put the warmth in, and then it was awesome. So we're at that point now with Atmos where it's less like, we're no longer doing the gimmicks unless it's part of the arrangement, right? And it's just a delivery format, and it's a delivery format that understands how many speakers you have. What kind of system you're having. Are you wearing headphones? Are you listening to two speakers? Are you listening in your car with a 5.1 system?
Well, I think the Apple AirPods, when you have the spatial audio on, I think that was the first time I unknowingly experienced the Dolby Atmos. I had put it on. I was just listening to a song, and it automatically, I was like, whoa, what is this? It was all completely spread out, and it was cool. But then what's equally cool is kind of like you said, is turning that off and hearing it still as a stereo file. I mean, it sounded better than what I've heard on just a traditional. It was just different. I don't know how to. It's hard to describe it. It's something like you kind of just got to experience it. But
right.
There was almost like a more of a depth to it than what I'm used to hearing.
Right.
So like when it folds down to that stereo, mix down, it still sounds better than when you just go the traditional route, and in an intangible way. I can't even really describe it.
No, it's okay, and it's the artist's choice. That's the thing. It's like people are feeling like, Apple and the labels are forcing us down our throat. No, we're not. No, they're not. Well, no, we're not. No, they're not. You can put stereo in just the left and the right speaker, and that's it. And just say, all right, that's the new format. That's what I'm going. If somebody said, hey, listen, we're no longer using WAV files. We're using AIF files, right? All right, fine. I'll load it into an AIF. That's what you could say, Mm-hmm. And like I said, we should do a whole...
We could go on a whole
discussion on this, and be more than happy to, because I think part of your team, right? That's what we do too, especially when artists are here. It's like if you hear something in Atmos and you realize it's like, wow, you've been listening to the stereo version, suddenly you get it, and it's up to the team to say to the artist, the band, like, listen, we got to start thinking about this. Like maybe you don't want it now, but maybe I just got an email this morning from a marketing person, a PR person working with a band. Alan, can you do Atmos for us on this? And I'm like, yeah. Why? Well, because it is a primary way to get into those playlists, right? It's a primary way to make your mix sound a little bit different than somebody else's. Mm-hmm. So you can't ignore stereo. It's just, this is like the add-on to stereo. That's the way we have to think of it.
Well, it's also like when people are thinking or bands are thinking about how they want to promote their music, and they're thinking about what formats they want. They could choose to just go digital streaming, or what kind of physical copies they want to make. Do they want to do vinyl? Do they want to do CD? Well, this is another way to get the music out there, and kind of like you said, since it's newer and not as many people are adopting it yet, it has the benefit of being giving you another avenue to kind of reach a larger audience, kind of thing. It's not
or a smaller audience, right? But a smaller dedicated audience, your super fan, right?
Yep.
Like if you could give your super fan something that's going to make them tell everybody else, oh my God, you got to hear this. I mean, that's kind of what used to happen with vinyl, 40, 50 years ago, right? Somebody would have a record and you'd go over their house to hear it, because the radio station may play the single once an hour or whatever they were doing, but like to really get into the artist, you went over your friend's house and you listened to the whole vinyl, and the whole side, both sides. And I think that's what's a beautiful attribute here about Atmos is like, not everybody has to have the 7.1.4 system or a 5.1 or a soundbar and a subwoofer. But like for that super fan to say, oh man, you got to come over and check this out. Now suddenly it's two people telling two people. But if your mix doesn't do that, and the other thing is there was a lot of talk early on about how expensive this is. And it was, but it's not anymore. It's built into the software. We're understanding it. You and I are putting, processes together to make it really affordable for artists to go down this lane and have their product available there. But again, it's teamwork.
Teamwork. That's going to be like the title of the
have
episode.
It flashing up there.
Yeah,
teamwork.
Yes, definitely. So I want to be mindful of your time. There's just a couple things I wanted to touch on, and then I'll let you go back to, I'm sure, your very, very busy day.
This is
one
fun.
Thing
this is good.
I was wondering, is there any truly nightmare experience you had that you could share? And if you can't, that's fine.
Every other day, right? I think that, the nightmare experiences are a couple of things. One is, like I said, just not, artists just not realizing what they're doing, and again, I think, artists that would even be approaching you from a mixing standpoint, like you could get involved at mixing at many different levels, right? And if a band says, like, listen, really, I want to work with you on mixing this, how can I save money? Because I want you involved, but I can't maybe afford to hire you for the entire month or whatever, right? So, you're going to work with them and say, okay, let's figure this out. That's a lot of the nightmare stories, are just, artists that just believe that, these magic plugins are really the answer, And so, I saw one commercial, putting this one plugin on every single track of my mix just made it 90% there, And it's like, yeah, made it sound 90% just like everybody else's mix that's out there. And you're not going to get noticed,
Yep.
We used to have a phrase, sounds great, change it. In a sense that it's like, you've got to be original. You've got to be an artist. That's what sticks out. That's what gets noticed. Stay in your lane, work with people that know that lane, but don't be afraid of pushing some of those limits in areas. That's what the ear tunes into. The ear tunes into something. Whoa, that's a little different. What was that? Oh,
Yeah. And I don't want to go down another rabbit hole here but you just made me think of this as like, and not to kind of debate analog.
We'll do this once a month, okay?
Yeah.
We'll do. You keep supplying me. You keep supplying me with the good coffee, and we'll keep moving.
Coffee
so
with Dan and Alan. But not to go into the debate of the digital world versus the analog world, but part of the reason why I like having a bit of analog gear, I do a hybrid setup with my mixing, is having the few pieces of analog gear that I do have, I feel like allows me to be a little bit more unique with how I mix, because I'm not just using a plugin with a preset that a million people use, and even to go along with that, when with bands doing sample replacement on drums, everyone has access to the same great sounding samples, but then everything starts to sound the same. I try and use, if I do use samples, which I try and get away without using as much as possible, I have, from the years of recording bands, I've always, in every session when I recorded drums, recorded samples of that person's kit, of the drummer's kit. And I try and use my own personal samples on the stuff I do. So it's like that little touch of analog is like, that's, even if you have the same piece of analog gear, that no two pieces sound exactly alike. So I like having that it forced me to kind of create a little bit more of my own sound, a little bit less of the sameness that's out there, because everyone has access to these plugins and things start to sound a bit the same. So
well, there's also, I think, there's an analog process that can also be achieved in digital, right? It's kind of like, having a fader pack rather than a mouse, right? Like mixing with, X amount of faders versus just the mouse. The same thing, you're just moving something on a screen, but there's something tactile about the way you feel it out, and you can actually do more than one finger at a time or something, right? There is a process, I think, that's more important that we would call analog than just, a technology, of it being in an analog world. And it just so happens, I think, that a lot of the analog gear flows with that, right? It's just that there's a tactileness of getting the feel for where something sits and being able to not focus on the visual of what's happening, right? You're listening. I find that that's a big key, is that I'm listening more. I'm turning a knob and I'm listening rather than looking at a screen with a mouse moving something up or down,
Well, yeah, and I find like with things like when you're EQing, when I have a digital EQ and I could see how wide the Q is and stuff like that, I start making decisions sometimes based on, well, that just looks too wide. I shouldn't do that. Or whereas when I EQ with analog, I don't actually know what it's setting. It just, there's just a number. I don't know what that actually means. And then I just adjust it to sound. And I probably, if I saw what it was doing, I would be saying, no, you can't do that. Like that, that's against the rules. But, like the rules.
And that's the weird thing, right, is that these software manufacturers think like we want to see what's happening, right?
Yeah.
No, maybe they should like get rid of all that graphical stuff. Like, I mean, what's that EQ, the Q3, Q4, whatever it is, right? And it's just like people are raving over the graphical interface that shows you. It's just like, yeah, but like what you're just doing, I see it all the time. People are just making a flat waveform. They're just evening out every frequency. But that's just white noise. You put all that flat, that's why I say they just put this one plug-in on all the tracks and I'm 90% there. Yeah, you're 90% there to white noise. Congratulations,
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Yeah.
Yep. I've got one more question for you, but before I ask that, is there anything you want to say or talk about or dive into? Anything about anything?
I guess I'm always preaching, having a distinctive quality, having a distinctive sound, whatever that is. And again, plugins tend to get us away from being distinctive, right? I mean, you would think that, if you had given, the Beatles a Pro Tools system with unlimited plugins, they would make something tremendously creative. Maybe not. Maybe your brain just shuts down, which is that, option paralysis concept, right? That with too many options, you just can't make a choice, right? So sometimes that's a good thing. And just being distinctive, if you only have a certain number of knobs in front of you or a certain amount of gear, that works towards that end, trying to find something that defines the sound of what you are. Bands will always, say, we love that sound. So-and-so, that band has a sound. Yeah, and probably, if you were in the studio and you had that sound, at the time, you were probably thinking like, yeah, this is cool. But they weren't copying somebody else, So, be original, be distinctive, do something, stay in your lane. And that's, part of that team's effort is to rein people back in. Like, oh, no, you're going too far with that. Whatever. Let's bring it back so that we don't, get pulled out of that playlist. But that's a big thing. And then second thing is just, remember, this is not your last record. Hopefully, you're on a process. Enjoy this. You're making art. If this one is successful, you're going to be asked to do it again. So don't guess, think about it, think hard about it, don't copy, don't guess, think about what you want your sound to be. And if you become successful, you'll know what to do, which is just to be yourself, do your thing.
Yeah. You kind of answered my last question without me having to ask it. But I was going to say, if you could give one piece of advice to a new metal band that was entering the studio for the first time, what would it be before they even think about mastering? But you kind of talked about that. It's kind of like being original and
I mean, there's a pretty successful like industrial hip hop group that I do a lot of work with, Dialect, and they used to come into the mastering and they would put on like a record that they wanted to be influenced by, but it was not in their lane. It was just something completely different. Like we actually listened, I think, to Fleetwood Mac Rumors one time. And another time, I want to say it was a Black Sabbath record, and obviously there's no direct correlation with either of those albums and this band, but they just wanted to bring on that kind of feel of something, and so, and again, when, you asked earlier, like working on so many different genres, as a mastering engineer, it's like, what is that? That's the benefit of it is thinking about, hey, this has kind of got a little bit of this feel. Maybe we should be leaning this way, I don't know. I preach that distinctive quality thing to bands all the time because I see the bands that, you're going to go out. There's a lot of hard work ahead of you. Get with your team, make the best possible product you can because it's hard work afterwards,
Yep.
So make sure you stand behind what you're putting out there.
Yep. Pearls of wisdom, as always. Well, Alan, I appreciate you coming on, my first guest on the show, and I kind of like your idea of, maybe making it somewhat regular. I certainly want to do an episode on Dolby Atmos just exclusively.
I think that could be fun because it's kind of your it's your future. It's a lot of people's future in the business, and learning how to work with it is really kind of key. As we have David here, who's just a monster at it. I mean, I go back to mixing Mastodon and Neurosis and Between the Buried and Me and 5.1. And, when we were doing the Atmos, I was trying to explain everything about that and like what worked and what didn't work, why we have the stones on the wall and things. There's all this stuff. And he just took everything I taught him and just ran with it, and I think that's what's going to happen. And I think successful bands are going to get that. And I'll save those stories. Let's send some more coffee beans down, okay. and we'll do a special Atmos chapter.
I gotta get down there to you, and it's been almost a year since I've actually been there. I think,
been here, already. Yeah. Well, that is something that's interesting too. Is that like I do get a lot of producers that don't always show up for every project. But when you do come down, in your case, coming down, to the studio, it's not as much just the session, but it's like a hang, right?
Yeah.
And that's an important part of working together. Even just Zoom calls or, whatever it is with the band, is staying in communication. I think we've gotten very far away from that. And I think we have to make a concerted effort to make sure we're all communicating again and we're working as those teams. That's, after all, that's what it's about. Somebody said to me, like, what would you have said to yourself 10 years ago that you wish you would have paid attention to, right? And it's like, I wish I would have paid attention more to like my friendships and my family, right? Mm-hmm. And you can't forget that stuff, mm-hmm. and you got to hang with the people. That's what this is about.
Yeah. It's always a good time when I am down there. So
yeah, cool.
I got to get down there again. Yeah.
Maybe we'll do the Atmos one from down here. That's maybe the key.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Alan. I'll let you get back to what you're doing, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Awesome, Dan. We'll talk to you soon. All right, bye.